Hey, what's going on, everyone? Another video just because yesterday, right before or right after, depends on the time, after releasing my last video where we're kind of still theorizing, hey, what could these skills be, what were main class, what were not, so on and so forth. 4Gamer and Dengenki magazine, these are two Japanese magazines or online magazines, essentially released the skill trees. Usually this happens around this time. Wasn't too sure if it was going to happen right away, or it was going to be closer to Tuesday, right before Slayer launches. But anyway, now we know what all the skills are. And if you saw my last video, essentially with my adjustments that I made, I guessed it. So there's nothing really new there, but we still didn't know what were the main class, what were the Gunblade only, and what were the skills that anyone can use if they're subbing Slayer. So let's go through that. I think that's the most important thing, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this impacts some of the classes. I think some of the classes are going to benefit from Slayer as a sub, others not so much, and we'll get into that. But anyway, let's make this quick. Gunblade focus, as we can see, it's Gunblade only. That makes sense. So as your focus meter builds, you're going to have increases in potency. You're going to have increases in PP recovery. You're also going to reduce PP usage, or you're going to have more PP reduction. If you looked at the last video that Sega posted, they also had grouped crit with that, but we had already talked about the fact that no, Gunblade focus, the skill itself is not going to have a crit factor, and probably the reason why it's not going to have a crit factor is because that is going to be main class only, and that is what we see. I know we're jumping around a bit, but Gunblade focus critical up. So once again, as your focus increases, so does your crit. That is going to be main class only. Overdrive. Once again, this is an active ability. When activated, you max out your focus meter for a certain period of time. If you use the ability again, you do a giant attack that then also burns through your focus. We already knew that this was main class only. Gear amplifier or gear amplify. Gunblade only. That makes sense because it's Gunblade focus oriented, which is Gunblade only. I do want to call out, what does this mean when I say Gunblade only? Because I know on some Discord chatter and probably other people around the way, this means that focus increases potency, increases PP recovery, increases PP reduction for Gunblade only. So you're not going to be able to use Gunblade to build up focus and then carry that over to whatever your multi-weapon is. Just want to clarify, when these skills say Gunblade only, these benefits only impact Gunblade. This has never changed, but I know there's been some talk and some thought that, oh, this could be a potential. No, this is going to function like everything else. Then we have Gunblade reset PP gain, another Gunblade only skill, which makes sense because it's tied to Gunblade focus. Essentially, once you lose your focus, you will regain a certain amount of PP. Unreleased rage, we already knew this, main class only. Made sense that unreleased rage after effect was main class only because they also told us that. Then we get into blade counter. So this is our weapon action counter when we're not using a directional input. That is Gunblade only, makes sense. But its critical rate, as we discussed in my previous video, was likely going to be main class only because crit is very, very powerful. That's how you're going to keep balance and making sure these subclass of Slayer doesn't become too overwhelming. But we'll get into more of that in a little bit. Mobile Blade, also Gunblade only. Mobile Blade counter, Gunblade only. No critical up skill, so you're losing a lot of damage because you don't have the crit. And then Gunblade Focus Overflow, which we theorized in my last video and then it was confirmed, is that essentially, yes, this does influence Unreleased Rage. So essentially when your focus gear is maxed, it reduces the cooldown and also charges quicker with things like Overdrive and Max Focus. Makes sense that because it's Overdrive and Unreleased Rage related, it's main class only. Slugshot, Gunblade only. Relentless Blade, Gunblade only, but figured that Relentless Blade Reinforce is main class only because the other reinforced skills across Ranger and Tector are also main class. And then we look at our sub skills that we're going to be using as Slayer sub, which is critical up, gallant attack up, critical hit PP gain. There are no conditions to that other than Slayer being your subclass. And then we get short range hotshot and charge blade, which are also Gunblade only, which makes sense. These are all Gunblade attack. What can we tell from just looking at the main class only abilities or the Gunblade only abilities, so on and so forth? Chances are the viability of using Gunblade or Gunslash, depending on your region, as your main weapon when you're subclassing Slayer is likely not going to be ideal. Once again, you're losing off the bat that 10% main class damage, but other than critical up and Gallon attack critical up, which I believe, especially for a subclass, is not going to be that high. I would be surprised if with these two skills combined, you're going to get more than 10%. And I'm not even sure you're going to get 10%. It might be between 7.5 and 10%, who knows? But other than that, all of your critical rates are locked behind the main class. Your two main big damage dealers and focus builders, Unreleased Rage and Overdrive, are locked behind main class. So there's really not much you're getting. So unless Sega has completely fumbled the bag and just made Slayer super powerful without these abilities, you're probably not going to be doing too much. This is not going to be a katana situation. Speaking of classes, let's talk about those who are probably going to benefit from Slayer as a subskill, or excuse me, as a subclass, and classes who might not for many of reasons. And so let's get into that. So let's start with Hunter. I think Hunter, and even Fighter, Braver, I think all the melee classes, they're fairly simple. I think all the melee classes are going to benefit from Slayer sub. Like if we look at Hunter's skill tree, you know, it's very weapon dependent. Hunter in of itself doesn't really, actually, what am I talking about? Hunter doesn't require any sub weapon. So really the subclass you're using is generally going to be Hunter Force for the PP, which could be covered by the crit PP gain. Hunter Bouncer because you get the additional damage on part break, but also some benefits on physical down. And then of course, Hunter Fighter, if you want to get that down damage. Of course, that's only on down damage. And so the question becomes, will the crit rate be enough when you look at the course of, say, a boss fight, where the damage you get overall, just critting regardless if they're down or not? Is that better than the additional down state damage? Is it better than having faster physical downs or more frequent physical downs, which chances are, given how purple runs run, probably not as valuable? So, you know, I'm just going to kind of skip through Hunter, Fighter, Braver, because chances are it really comes down to how does the crit measure up to the other abilities they have when it comes to Bouncer. Soaring Blades. Actually, that's actually interesting now that I think about it. Because I know some Bravers use Soaring Blade. So that might be a situation to where, no, Slayer might not be ideal for Braver. But I'm not too sure. But I know Hunters generally don't use Soaring Blade because they already have enough to deal with in their kits. Fighter as well, when it comes to just maintaining Double Saber. You know, those are very weapon dependent. So I guess if you're a Braver who uses katana only, you're probably fine. Or even bow. Chances are bow will be ideal, just because technically you can use bow rifle. You know, I have to think about bow a little bit because I know bow just needs work in general. Ranger, I think we were all thinking that Ranger's probably going to get the most glow up just because, hey, it's range. You've got weak bullet. And so with the range stat, Gunblade, and weak bullet, it was like, hey, this is going to be great. Given the main class skills of Gunblade, that probably reduces that a bit. But I think when you look at Ranger, it's very rifle launcher dependent. You know, you're not really seeing Ranger use any other weapons now, especially when you have rifle grenade. You've got to utilize that. So chances are Slayer is going to be a nice subclass for Ranger, just that additional crit damage on top of all the other things that it does well. Now, Gunner. This one is probably going to be on my list for a class that is not going to benefit as much as others, at least, with Slayer. And the reason for that is Ranger. One of the issues that Gunner has, and I guess it's not really an issue, it works for them, but it does limit them in their flexibility, is that because rifle is their main class weapon, they don't get any damage detriments when using things like rifle grenade. And so The question you have to ask yourself as a gunner is, am I going to get more damage on the crit I get from Slayer versus the damage I get from Rifle Grenade? And so I think this is one of those classes to where, unless you just want to be TMG only, or there's some utility with Gunblade that provides some benefit that's going to overcome the monstrous power that is Rifle Grenade, I feel like Gunner Ranger is still going to be the go-to class for Gunner. I could be wrong, but once again, I'm only thinking we're getting, for subclass, for crit, 10%, which when you look at your crit damage, which could either be 32% how it currently is, or if you use fixed determinant of 5, it gets up to what, about 52%? I think it's multiplicative. Is that enough damage to change the flexibility and the frequency of Ranger grenades and all the other things that it provides, especially when we start getting into spread shot, so on and so forth? So chances are Gunner's probably still going to be Gunner Ranger, but who knows? Force is another interesting one, and for a few reasons. Reason number one is Force does a lot of element damage. Actually, that's all they do. And so when you think of element damage, you're also thinking about elemental downs. And so the question becomes, will the 10% crit, and of course that's just an assumption, be better than what you can get from Bouncer and also Tector? So I'm also putting Force on the list of, you might not be benefiting as much as other classes with the Slayer sub. You might be benefiting more from the Slayer add-on skills. And so once again, just to remind everyone, the add-on skills that you really want to focus on, of course, is the main class skill, which is you increase your crit rate at a maximum, which is likely looking like 15%. If we look at the headline and how things looked, specifically the Japanese headline, which gave you more insights into what it's going to look at after level 10. But let's say 15% additional crit rate on down, and photon blast cooldown reduction, which is probably going to be like 25%. So instead of having a 2-minute cooldown, you're going to have a 90-second cooldown, more or less. And so this becomes interesting because forces are also down monsters. And so you might want to stick with Force Bouncer, even if you don't want to use Jet Boots, because that increases your element down rate, and thus you're doing more crit, and thus crit damage when the enemy is down. With Slayer, you're not going to have those abilities. And so even though, yes, you have the increased crit and the down potential, is that going to outweigh those other abilities, especially on part break? With Bouncer, when you break apart, you get 1% damage. And so that's already going to cut into the differential of Slayer when it comes to its crit abilities. The other thing to call out is compound techniques, which also, of course, are element down accumulation monsters, and Force builds them very fast. So the question becomes, should I go Force Tector? Is that something that becomes more beneficial now because the compound tech gauge amplifier is a skill that exists for both Force and Tector, and so I'm doubling down on how quickly I get compounds, which means I'm doubling down on how much faster I build down accumulation, which means I down faster, I down more potentially, and thus the Slayer add-on skill kicks in. The other benefit of Force Tector is photon blast accumulation. When we look at the weak element skill from Tector, you get additional photon meter when using elemental attacks that are matching the weak element, in addition to Awake Yell, which essentially increases all of your photon blast meter capabilities when in the presence of a boss. And so if we group that in addition to the Slayer add-on skill, the PB cooldown reduction, are those things more impactful than just getting the crit rate? So it'll be interesting to see how forces balance this when you have both Tector and Bouncer. They give a lot of benefits that now get kicked back thanks to the Slayer add-ons. So I'm also going to put this one in the camp of might not be the ideal candidate for a Slayer subclass. I'm going to skip over Tector, and we talked about Braver a little bit, and focus on Bouncer, which I believe is probably a no-brainer. And I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of Jet Boots, because I'm more familiar with Jet Boots than Soaring Blades, and really looking at this from Jet Intensity. Of course, everyone knows Jet Intensity because that is the reason why Forces and Tectors use Jet Boots. One of the big issues with jet intensity, and probably if I think about just bouncer across the board, is that it is very volatile when it comes to damage variance or floor potency. And you're basically praying for a crit, because if you don't crit on that last hit of jet intensity, you're probably losing a lot of damage, because the floor potency is going to cut into it, but it's also cutting to the other, 14 to 15 hits before you get that big hit. So crit is ideal for jet boots, and I'm pretty sure it's ideal for Fanatic Blade, just because the number of hits that equate to the total potency for an attack, you want to make sure those things are doing as much as possible. So I think this is a no-brainer. Essentially, if you're going bouncer, you're probably going still fix a fatal, and you're just building up that crit as much as possible to make sure that your big damaging hits aren't getting messed with damage variance. Yeah, and I don't really see any other subclass that provides any other benefit that doesn't kind of control the detriments that can come with the class and its weapons. And then, of course, once again, it's also got its element decline and its physical decline and its decline amplification abilities. Those Slayer add-ons are also going to be a benefit. So I think this is just stacking it. I mean, just think about your jet intensities with 70% crit on damage. Like, you can't really say no to that, even though, granted, once you get past 60% crit rate, it starts losing its value, and you should really be focusing on fixed determina and crit damage. The breakpoint mathematically, and of course this changes based on your augments, but let's say you're running full floor potency or full variance, basically the current meta for best in slot, your breakpoint between crit rate and crit damage is about 35%ish. And of course, the more floor potency you lose for damage, the breakpoint increases to about 39 crit. But I think because things like jet intensity are so volatile, or can be volatile, I think bouncer really is going to kind of bend the rules a little bit and want to really focus on crit more than maybe other classes will. And of course, last but not least, Tector. I'm going to skip over Waker, because Waker is Waker. Like, do what you want. Chances are Waker Slayer is going to be fine. Waker is a self-contained class. Yeah, there's not much really more to say. There might be some nuances, but chances are, Anyway, Tector, the jack of all trades, master of none. This gets interesting. So I'm going to break this down a couple of ways. If we're focusing on being wand only, which I currently am, because just using jet boots has just gotten old for me personally, Slayer as a subclass is likely going to be ideal. I have gone back and forth in Stia Purple runs with going wand only versus wand jet boots. And if I were to do some fuzzy math, I would say the benefit of jet boots is that you're going to probably get an overall increase of about 3% damage across the run. But there's also utility in how you manage downs. Once again, that's that jet intensity. It's PP free. You know, it's definitely consistent. You can use it in different ways, definitely during down periods, and you get a lot of benefits. But if I were to say across the board, like how much power are you getting from jet boots, I would say overall 3%. There's a 3% difference. So if you were to use the same weapon, jet boots are giving you 3% more damage overall. And I kind of base it on times of runs and clears. So if we look at crit rate, well, we get additional 10% crit. Wand, I would say, is one of the ideal candidates for crit damage and fixed determina. Most of our attacks are one hit, 1 to 2 hits. You think of Wave Crash, technically it's 2 hits to get its full potency. You look at Swift Smash, it's 1 hit for full potency. You look at Element Revoke, it's 1 hit. So you look at counters, it's 1 hit. Versus something like Katana, where its potency is distributed across multiple hits. So when we think of, one-hit attacks, whether you crit or not essentially becomes, it's an all or nothing. It's binary, yes or no. If you don't crit, then you're just subject to floor potency and variance. If you crit, your crit damage is whatever your potency was. Unlike a skill where, let's say it's 1,000 potency, but it's over 10 hits. And so if you crit, it comes down to, well, how many hits did you crit? You're not going to just get, if crit damage is 50%, you're not just going to do 1,500 damage. You might only crit 3 of those 10 hits. So, you're just adding another 150 damage versus with one hit of 1,000, if you crit, you're doing 1,500, no questions asked. Because of that, if you're going wand only, I believe that Slayer as the subclass is ideal because you're leveraging your big single hit attacks. If they crit, you're getting all of that damage. If you still want to use jet boots because you like that play style, well, I think you have to refer back to when we were talking about jet boots and bouncer because you're going to lose that crit rate. You're now going to be leveraging and leaning more heavily into jet intensity. You're probably going to need more crit, which gets interesting because now for Tector, you kind of have to make a decision. Well, at least for now. Of course, once crit rate gets to a certain point where it doesn't mean anything, it's probably going to be less impactful. But right now, if you're using Neos, your base crit without Slayer is what? 15%. I forgot I had to remove the 13% because my Neos is a fix a fatal 4. It's 15%. So you're not going to have the Slayer sub because you have the bouncer sub. Your jet intensities, which are, once again, that's you're getting that 3% more damage from jet boots. You've got to sustain that as much as possible. You've got to control and manage that as much as possible. You're going to need more crit. So if you still want to use Tector Bouncer, which does have benefits, I wouldn't say as much benefits as Force because Tector does not down as much as Force, I would say. Of course, the benefit is that we get physical down, so it kind of evens things out. But you're going to want to control that crit. Once again, what's good about the Slayer add-on skills is that we benefit greatly. We do great down accumulation, not as great as others in the grand scheme of things, but still good. And of course, our main skill is Photon Blast. So it really comes down to how do we leverage the damage during downs? Bouncer, probably going to be crit rate. Slayer, fix a terminal. Force is interesting. I feel like Tector Force is not going to be something that is truly ideal anymore. Yes, we get more compound tech gauge amplifier, but as we've seen in my runs, Bouncer breakable part kind of overrules that. It's not as valuable. Bouncer in many situations still outperforms because of that increased down accumulation rate, because of you getting a little bit more damage when you break an enemy part, which is something to consider when we're looking at Tector Bouncer versus Tector Slayer. But I think being able to lean into that crit damage is going to overrule the additional increase in damage we get from enemy part break. And when we look at Tector Force, I don't think we get as much value from the compound tech gauge amplifier, but you never know. I think it really comes down to how do we manage downs and what do we use during the down states. And then of course, Tector Fighter, I believe Tector Fighter is no longer going to be a class we need to think about. The top three now are going to be Slayer, Bouncer, Force. Of course, there are a lot of Tectors out there now during the Arcs record runs for Geolabs 2 that have been using soaring blades as well. So if you are a Tector, Wand, Jet Boot, soaring blades, the Tector Bouncer probably might be better overall than Tector Slayer. But I think if you're saying, hey, I'm going to use Tector as my main weapon, I'm the wand only club, Tector Slayer is the way to go, especially because of the utility that we'll probably get from not only Slayer subclass, but also Gunblade. We've got things like Charge Blade. We've got things like Shifting Spica, which basically looks to be a vertical tracking move, and it's very fast and it's very long. So we can replace that from Surge Impulse as a way of getting in on our targets. We've also got the Rising Blade Photon Art that allows us to climb. I think when we combine those things with Encore Jump Swift Smash, Wand has a lot of tools to deal with a lot of situations that it didn't have before. And I think that's what's going to give it the edge without going into 3 different weapons, having to have so many different loadouts, having to have 2 best in slot weapons like you would with Tector Bouncer if you're using both soaring blades and jet boots. But other than that, the only thing we have left is just the numbers for Slayer. What is that crit rate going to be? What are all the other things going to be when it comes to the benefits that come with Gunblade and that come with Slayer? But other than that, this should be my last video on Slayer because, well, until it releases, because I doubt we're going to get those numbers until Wednesday. Other than that, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Any questions, feel free to ask, and I will catch you all next time.